All right, today I want to talk about a subject that is often discussed, especially when you're talking to people who don't believe in God. They'll often say, if there really is a God, then why in the world would there be so much pain and suffering and evil in the world? And it's a valid question that I don't think that we as Christians ought to shy away from. It's something that a lot of times, if we're honest with ourselves, we've probably thought about the question ourselves many times on many occasions. But a lot of times, people who ask that question don't really want the answer. They don't really want the real answer because the real answer may not necessarily be pleasant to them. But I don't think that we as Christians should shy away from it. I think that we as Christians ought to embrace it and find out what is it that allows a righteous God, but also allows sin and evil and suffering in the world today. And so I want to look at that subject just a little bit today, and I want to talk about it in just a little bit of detail. But before we even go into that, I want us to define evil. I want us to think in our own minds, what does evil actually mean? What is bad? What is wickedness? What is evil? And I want us to try and define that. And I want you right now, as you're watching this video, I want you to press pause, and I want you to think in your own mind, what is evil? What is bad? And I want you to try and define evil, try and define bad without actually using the words good or righteous or lovely, or without using any kind of opposite language. I want you to try and define evil without using its opposite, which is good. And so while you're doing that, I'm just going to give you just a couple of seconds to do that. Press pause, try and define evil, and then come right back. All right, I hope that you were able to do that, and as you did that, you probably found that it's very difficult to define evil. It's very difficult to define bad without good, or evil without righteousness. It's very difficult, not necessarily impossible, but it's very hard to come up with a definition that doesn't include the opposite. And so what I wanted to do with that exercise is I wanted you to notice that most of what we view as evil, most of what we view as bad is in light of good. And it is for that very reason that I believe that evil exists. When we look at the Old Testament in Genesis chapter 1, when God created everything, God didn't create everything with sin. God didn't create everything with wickedness. God didn't create everything with suffering or trials or problems. He created everything completely perfect. And in fact, when God created everything, he looked on his creation and he said, it is good. And at many points, he said, it is very good. And when he created Adam and Eve, he created them sinless. They were completely sinless. They had no cares in their life. They were given some responsibilities, but ultimately they were sinless. They didn't do anything wrong. They didn't do any kind of sin. There was no evil. There was no wickedness. And if you go back into the Old Testament and you read about where Satan came from, Satan came from heaven. And in heaven, there was no evil. There was no wickedness. And all of these things were completely perfect before the sin arrived. And so why did the sin arrive? The sin arrived in both cases because the people who were there grew dissatisfied with where they were at. And the reason they grew dissatisfied is because they didn't see an alternative, or they felt like the alternative wasn't what they wanted. In man's case, they were told, if you just eat of the tree of the knowledge of fruit of the knowledge of good and evil, you will be just like God. And that's what they wanted. They wanted to be like God. They felt like God was holding something back from them. They didn't realize how good they had it. They didn't realize how much God really loved them because all they saw was the goodness in their life. All they saw were the good things that were happening in their life. They didn't realize how much where those good things came from. They didn't realize that those good things were an opposite to something. And then when they sinned, when they disobeyed God, then they realized the opposite of what it was that they were experiencing. They were experiencing greatness. They were experiencing wonderfulness. They were experiencing righteousness, and they didn't understand what sin was. They didn't understand what suffering or wickedness or evil was until they experienced it, and then they realized just how good their life was beforehand. A good illustration is in the New Testament, Jesus describes Christians as the light of the world in Matthew chapter 5. He says, "Ye are the light of the world. A city that is set on a hill cannot be hid." And the light of the world means that we are light that shines in darkness. And if you've ever had a flashlight and the batteries begin to go dead, and that flashlight gets dimmer and dimmer and dimmer, as you shine that flashlight in the daylight, it doesn't look very bright. In fact, you could take a flashlight that is just about dead, where it's just shining a little bit, and you turn it on in the middle of the day in a well-lit room like this room right here, and it doesn't seem like it's going to work. It doesn't seem like it's working at all. And then you turn off the lights. As soon as you turn off the lights, all of a sudden that little dim light, the brightness of that light has not changed at all. But what happens is the darkness comes around, and as that light shines, it shoves away all the darkness, and it shows even brighter because of the darkness around it. And when we look at suffering, when we look at evil, when we look at wickedness in the world, the reason there is so much evil, suffering, wickedness in the world is because it is through that wickedness, through that evilness, through that suffering in this world that God is able to shine brighter. At one point, Jesus was with his disciples, and there was a blind man who came to Jesus, and he was healed by Jesus. And after he was healed, the disciples said, "Lord, who sinned? Was it this man or his parents?" And Jesus said, "Neither his parents nor him, but that the Lord might be glorified." The whole reason that that man was blind was not because of some sin that he had committed, was not because of some wickedness. It was because God wanted to be glorified through the suffering. Because of the suffering, he was able to be healed. God was able to fix the problem because there was a problem that existed. And God is somebody who fixes things, and God wants us to see his glory. And the best way for us to see his glory is to see his glory in light of the alternative. And that's what we see today. We see the alternative. God gave man a free choice when he created them. He created us in his image with the ability to make moral choices. And when we make the wrong moral choices, as Adam did, the Bible says that death came by one man. So as by one man sin entered in the world, and death by sin. And that one man was Adam. And when Adam sinned, it caused everyone to have to suffer the consequences. And that was the alternative to God's righteousness. And as we look at the two dichotomies, we look at the two different situations, we see goodness and we see righteousness, and then we see wickedness and we see evil. When we look at the two in comparison, then God's brightness, God's righteousness looks so much better up against the wickedness and the evil that we face today. And I want us to really think about that, especially in this time when we're going through hard times. You know, we're stuck at home in this quarantine, and people are literally dying all around this country, and the world seems like it's coming to an end. The economy is crashing, and everything seems to be going down the tubes, and we're wondering, when is it going to end? And if it is going to end, how are we going to come out of this? And I want us to go back to Romans chapter 8. I'm going to finish with this. In Romans chapter 8, there's a verse that is often quoted, and it's often used to encourage Christians, and I think sometimes misused to encourage Christians. And what it is Romans chapter 8, verse 28. It says, "All things work together for good to them that love him, to them that are called according to his purpose." Now I know that passage says that it's to them that love God, to them that are called according to his purpose. I don't want to focus so much on that because I believe that many of the people who are watching this are probably already saved. What I want to focus in on is that first part. It says all things work together for good. Does that mean that all things are good? Well, no, it doesn't. What it means is that all things work together for good. And what happens is so many times we think that everything's got to be good, hunky-dory, great, and wonderful, and we think that if it's not, there's something wrong. But that's not necessarily the case. When you go to the gym and you work out, it's not always fun to work out, but the end result is what we are looking for. We're looking for that strength in our muscles. We're looking for the health and wellness that we get from exercise. When we go to school, we're not extremely thrilled about the prospect of studying and trying to memorize all these different things for tests, but what we are excited about is the end result. We get a diploma, we get the knowledge that we need in order to get through life. And all of those things, you have to get through the bad in order to get to the good. When you bake a cake, you have all these different ingredients. You have raw eggs, you have flour, you have salt, you have baking soda, you have all these different things, and individually, not all of them are great. Sugar might be good by itself, maybe even chocolate chips if you're making chocolate chip cookies, but for most of the time, the ingredients aren't necessarily good by themselves, but when you combine them all together and you put them in the oven and you pull them out, you get a delicious cake or a delicious pie or a delicious cookie. All of those things work together for good. And as a Christian, I want us to really recognize God in this. And we see all the wickedness around us and the wickedness in the world around us and all the evil that exists. And we think, well, how can God exist with all of this evil? Well, I want to ask you a question. If you were to walk around and you see all kinds of people with unkept hair and unkept beards and different things like that, and they're not keeping their hair is all scraggly and long and not really, it looks like they haven't been kept or anything like that, would you say that barbers don't exist? Well, no, you wouldn't say that. The problem isn't that the barbers don't exist, it's that the barber doesn't necessarily get to everybody. It's not that God doesn't exist, it's that God doesn't get to everybody. And it's not because God can't get to everybody, it's because many don't let God in. Many don't want God in their lives. Many people don't go to the barber because they like their long hair. But as a Christian, we ought to want God in our lives, and we ought to welcome God with open arms to come in and fix our problems. And I want us to take this time where you're stuck at home and you're quarantined and you can't really get out and do anything. I want us to really take this time to get a hold of God and see what kind of goodness, what kind of righteousness, what kind of wonderful things can God bring out of this horrible situation, because God can always take a horrible situation and turn it around. And I want us to really focus on God, and I want us to think about how can God take this situation. And as we're stuck at home, I want you to take this time to pray. Get on your knees and pray and read your Bible and get a hold of God and understand His righteousness. Don't focus so much on the evil and the wickedness around you, but instead allow God's righteousness to shine through that darkness, to where we see that darkness, and as we are surrounded by that darkness, the light of God and His Word shines even brighter. Going back to that flashlight that's just about dead because the batteries are almost gone. In a well-lit room, when everything's going great and our lives are wonderful and we don't have a care in the world, it's hard to see God. But in the circumstances like today, where we see the world falling apart and we see all these different things going on in our lives, and maybe we're going through suffering in our own lives, and we have all these different problems, it's very easy in these times to see God, because just like that dim flashlight seems dim against the light of the room, when it's against the darkness that we turn off the lights, we block all the windows, once it's in the darkness, all of a sudden that light looks really bright. And when we're in this time of trouble and struggles, and as we're suffering and we're going through all these different things, God's light seems that much brighter. And let's allow God to be bright. Let's allow God's brightness to get a hold of our lives and allow us to reflect His brightness. Just as the moon reflects the light of the sun and we can see the moon at night, let's be the moon. Let's be the moon that reflects God's righteousness, and everybody can see us, and we are that city set on a hill that cannot be hid. And so I want us to take this time and really focus on God and see, what is God going to do through this situation? What greatness and goodness is God going to bring out of this wickedness and evil? And not focus on how can God exist with all this evil in the world, but instead let's focus on what can we do to show God's greatness through this evil and suffering that we are going through in the world today.